The Chicago Bears offensive line feels like it's in such a better spot right now than it was just a week ago, with two veteran free agent signings right on the eve of training camp. And now the real training camp offensive line battles can begin.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today, and hopefully every day. On the show today, we get a better sense of the new look Chicago Bears offensive line. Reiff joining Michael Schofield as last-minute additions before training camp, and now we have a better sense of what this line looked like and what the competitions are looking like at training camp, how that might shape things up for this season. So we'll get a sense of the new offensive line combination battles. We'll kind of go through Reiff's career and history up to this point, what we can expect from him in Chicago, and how Ryan Poles pulled off some savvy financial manipulating with both contracts to keep the salary cap numbers low and leave the Bears with plenty of salary cap space still sitting out there to make additional moves as they see fit. Most importantly, Reiff, along with Michael Schofield, really gives this Bears offensive line the legitimacy that it's been missing all offseason. It's been pretty much concern number one on our board from the beginning of free agency in March through the NFL draft. Yes, they drafted 4 guys on the third day of the draft, but they're all more or less toward the end of the draft and not necessarily guys that you're going to be able to rely on very much, at least in this first rookie season, if not longer after that. The hole at right guard was huge, and Michael Schofield was a nice addition to shore that up, but we still had questions about the tackle spots, and that's where Reiff now comes in at the start of training camp and presumably looking to lock down a side. At least that's what we're expecting. It's not being given to him just yet. Right now, the Bears are still letting the rookie 5th-round pick Braxton Jones rotate in with the first team. I think during individual drills, during team drills, Braxton Jones was the one getting those first team snaps as a rookie out of a small school, still in training camp ahead of Reiff. Reiff was limited at practice as things really got going for the first time yesterday on Wednesday. You would think then, once Reiff fully gets up to speed and is at 100%, he's more or less going to lock down that left tackle spot as the truly consistent veteran starter that was brought in really to lock down that side. We'll kind of get into some of that experience and consistency of him coming up here in a little bit. But I think that left tackle battle is still going to be a thing that they continue for now to get Braxton Jones some of those snaps. And maybe, you have some versatility options there to get Tevin Jenkins some at left tackle or Larry Borum or however you want to do it. But we're all pretty much expecting, writing in pencil on our week 1 depth chart, that Reiff is going to be the Bears left tackle, just not fully handed to him just yet getting into the building. Same thing is happening at right guard. Sam Mustipher took, I think, all the snaps, if not the majority of the snaps, at right guard at this first training camp practice because Michael Schofield isn't full go yet with the team. Presumably, over these next few weeks, as Schofield gets up to 100% and ramped up, he should, in theory, supplant Sam Mustipher from that right guard job. Another one of these, write it in pencil on your week 1 starting lineup card, because we're all expecting it to happen and to have Mustafa then moved to the bench as a backup guard/center option on the interior. In theory, Reiff and Schofield should lock down those positions and then create this enhanced competition at right tackle between Larry Borom and Tevin Jenkins. For now, Larry Borom remains in the lead in that spot. He's been getting more of the first team reps, while Jenkins has been practicing with the backups at both left and right tackle to potentially be that swing tackle off the bench, which is not necessarily where you want your second round pick to be. You'd feel better that your fifth round pick was maybe the backup and your second round pick was the starter, but that's not where this team is right now. There's still a lot of time for that competition. That one's truly wide open. I'm not ready to write in Larry Borom just yet as your week one starter at right tackle. I think Tevin Jenkins is playing from behind at this point, but that's not to say that he can't still be the better tackle 3 weeks from now and be ready to go by week one as your starting right tackle. And because both players have now played both sides, and you can kind of get a sense of either way, one can be that valuable swing tackle, and both can still develop, and that no matter who starts this season, doesn't mean that the backup on the bench is destined to never be a starter again either, that there will be development for both of them. And Riley Reiff is only in Chicago on a 1-year deal. So perhaps, you go into next offseason, you come back to the plan of Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borom as your offensive tackles with another year of experience behind them, and perhaps at least a full season of starting for one of them, whoever ends up as that right tackle starter. And there's also some injury history with Riley Reiff to suggest that maybe a backup offensive tackle could get a little bit of playing time in the starting lineup at some point this season. Could be Braxton Jones then at left tackle if Tevin Jenkins is going to be more your backup right tackle as it stands right now, but not writing Tevin Jenkins off fully yet until the pads are on and we get some real training camp practices under his belt to kind of separate Borom and Jenkins a little bit more in that competition that's for now still wide open. Signing Riley Reiff gives them the luxury to sort of focus in those guys on one key spot and leave really only one offensive line spot unsettled more or less at this point. And then we'll kind of get into why Reiff is able to provide that consistency, why the Bears prioritized him as a free agent here right before training camp, and what his history has been in the NFL next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by Built Bars, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars ever. They are so good. They are like this candy bar flavor, sweetness, and experience that's actually good for you. It satisfies that sweet tooth without any of that unnecessary calories or sugar and junk that you just don't need. Because all Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew, they're delicious, but they're also low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It is an elite combination. I have not had any other product that can match what a Built Bar gives me. I eat one literally every single day. Had one right before I recorded this podcast. You got to try it for yourself. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code, LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next purchase. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Riley Reiff comes to the Chicago Bears as a very clear stabilizing force at the offensive tackle position. And really, he could play and start and play at a consistent level, either starting offensive tackle positions. They seem to be focusing him in at the left tackle spot and letting Jenkins and Borom handle the right tackle spot. But if over the course of time, Jenkins or Borom or even Braxton Jones, I suppose, shows enough of a propensity for left tackle specifically, they could just as easily move Riley Reiff to right tackle and let the other tackle competition be at that left spot, because Reiff has started at both in multiple schemes, multiple teams across his career, and performed at a very solid level. He's never been a true Pro Bowl guy, but he's always been a good to very good tackle, kind of fluctuating within that range. He was a first-round pick in 2012 out of Iowa. You might remember he went a handful of picks after the Bears took Shea McClellan. I remember in that draft class, there being some split among Bears fans, especially Bears fans who also happen to be Iowa football fans, which there's a lot of crossover between those two fan bases that did really want the Bears to take Riley Reiff, and he would have been a very consistent stabilizing factor for them at that time, and at the very least better than what the Bears got with their first round pick in 2012. Regardless, he's always been reliable in pass protection, never going to be like the true blue chip guy, but will hold up that blind side or I guess the front side of the right tackle. Either side can hold it up and, gets guys moving in the ground game too. He's a good offensive lineman, true and true. For the Bengals last year on a 1-year deal, played right tackle, was a starter for them, was maybe not as good as we've seen from Riley Reiff throughout his career, but, they got to the Super Bowl, right? I mean, they went all the way up there, so it wasn't like he was holding them back. There was a lot of thought in Cincinnati that they might still try and bring him back around training camp when the Bears ultimately got him instead. So some interest there. But before Cincinnati last year, he had been the Minnesota Vikings left tackle for a handful of seasons. And then before that, he played for the Lions, who drafted him in the first round. And I think he started his career at left tackle and then played right tackle toward the end. So his career went left tackle, right tackle, left tackle, right tackle. Now in Chicago, back to left tackle. He's kind of been alternating whenever he sort of changes teams or schemes. That ends up flipping what position he's playing for. And over his career, he has played some different varieties of offense. Early on in Detroit, for example, that was the Jim Bob Cooter days of offense. And also, I think Joe Lombardi, who's the Chargers offensive coordinator now, coming from, I guess, the same offensive coordinator that Michael Schofield was playing for, so there's a familiarity there. But those schemes being a little bit more power, gap type schemes, more pulling offensive lineman counters and traps and whams and those kind of things that are a little bit more downhill compared to the Bears' outside zone scheme under Luke Getsy that's a lot more sideline to sideline. But as Reiff kind of went throughout his career, goes to the Vikings. Pat Shurmur's the offensive coordinator. John DeFilippo, the Bears quarterbacks coach from last year, was the Vikings offensive coordinator. A little bit more like an inside zone rushing scheme then. And then Gary Kubiak came and took over as the outside zone scheme for the offensive coordinator for the Vikings. The last couple of seasons he was in Minnesota. So he got used to this style that the Bears want to run a little bit more. It's not exactly the same, but the same types of plays. His career sort of gone on that trajectory. And then last year in Cincinnati, he plays for Zach Taylor. The Sean McVay offense comes, generally speaking, from the same tree. McVay does it a little differently. Zach Taylor does it a little bit differently, and Matt Eberflus and Luke Getsy are going to do it a little bit differently. But there should be enough familiarity there and experience within this scheme that he'll be a good fit, and B, he won't have too much trouble, I think, getting up to speed. He's been a guy that's just been reliable. He consistently plays, almost 1,000 snaps a season, but also consistently throughout his career. It seems like he always ends up missing 1 or 2 games. I don't think there are very many years in his career where he's played 16, but it's almost always like 15 or 14. It's little things here and there. No super history of major debilitating injuries that take him out of lineup, but that propensity to miss a little bit here and there, which is not what I would call a major concern or anything, does add to the importance then of the competition at training camp right now, where it's why you get Braxton Jones, some of those first team reps still, even though it's going to be Riley Reiff, more or less, but you still want to give him those first team reps because odds are perhaps that Riley Reiff might miss a game or 2 with a minor injury. So you want Braxton Jones to be prepared. You want Tevin Jenkins to have some experience there, or whoever the backup's going to be, whether it's Borum or Jenkins on that side. You want options at left tackle in case you run into some of that issue of Reiff not being able to play a full season. He also gives you some of that flexibility to play right tackle if, Larry Borum or Tevin Jenkins gets hurt and you feel like you'd rather get Braxton Jones in there and move Reiff over to right tackle. You have a lot of options. So that's so much of the value that he gives to the Bears at a good value for the contract that they sign him. And the other thing that Reiff has done that I noticed throughout his career is, I remember early on and kind of in the middle stages there, he was penalized a lot. A lot of holdings, I think some false starts in there as well. But the last 2 seasons, the Bengals last year and his final year in Minnesota in 2020, he had 1 penalty in each of those 2 years, 1 a year. It's a lot better than the 9, 7, 6 seasons of penalties that he had earlier in his career. He has very much cut down on some of those types of, call it a discipline issue or whatever you want to call it, he has improved greatly on the penalty front. And that will be, again, a good example to set for a lot of these young offensive tackles. And another valuable thing there, too, right? He's got 3 tackles that are all rookies or second-year players on this depth chart with him. He will set that example and show them how to be professional NFL left tackles. And I think that's a great value for the Bears on a contract that was reported initially as fairly significant numbers. But when you dive behind the headlines a little bit there, you find out that the Bears actually structured it very strategically and are getting a good deal on Riley Reiff. We'll look at some of the salary cap implications and how the Bears still have plenty of salary cap space left after signing 2 offensive linemen next on Locked On Bears. When the initial Riley Reiff report came out, I believe it was ESPN's Adam Schefter that said, he was signing a 1-year deal worth, around $10-ish million with up to $12 million possible from it. And kind of raised some headlines of like, oh, wow, that's a big deal. The exact wording from Schefter was a 1-year deal worth up to $12.5 million with $10 million likely to be earned. It's like, wow, $10 million to get that left tackle in. Bears must have finally kind of upped their offer and really swung it through and had the salary cap space to do so. We've talked ever since June 1st. We talk about it a lot on this podcast. June 1st came around, Bears cap space shot way up. Didn't spend it. Weren't spending it. And we were wondering why they weren't spending it. And a good pushback point on that we got from one of the commenters on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel that, yes, it does take 2 parties to agree to a deal. Like, the Bears had the cap space, but players also then needed to agree to come to Chicago at whatever price the Bears were offering. And so you could see where perhaps players like Riley Reiff didn't have a lot of incentive to agree to a contract in May when they could just wait and show up at training camp and not have to go practice at OTAs and minicamp and all that stuff, and just wait, get the deal, kind of show up at training camp, get clocked in that way, and ramp up from there. So fair that it wasn't just pure. There are other explanations besides them purely just sitting on their hands waiting for training camp. But we saw those Riley Reiff numbers, and it was like, wow, okay, Bears ponied up. They said, we got to get an offensive tackle. Here's $10 million up to $12.5 million for Riley Reiff. And as it turns out, when you dive a little bit deeper in the numbers, not exactly the case. That he is not going to count $10 or $12.5 million against the Bears' salary cap this season. I mean, the agent wants it out there that Riley Reiff is getting up to $12 million so his agent can say, see, I got a great deal for my client. But once it goes on the books and we can see a little bit of the actual details of the contract, very team-friendly for the Bears. Brad Biggs from the Chicago Tribune kind of tweeted out some of the specific details on this contract. Riley Reiff's deal has a $3 million base salary. So that's like just the game day paychecks will split up $3 million across 17 games, 18 weeks. So, but then he will receive another $4.5 million if he's on the field for 10% of the team's offensive snaps and if the team improves in any of 6 offensive categories. We don't know what those 6 offensive categories are. I mean, it could just be like their rank in passing yards or something, or their points per game needs to improve or whatever. They can literally just pick. They can write whatever they want almost into that contract and say so it's not necessarily a difficult threshold to reach, but it is something that does need to be reached. So he needs to be on the field for 10% of the offensive snaps. If he gets hurt after 1 game or 2 games or whatever, he does not get then that $4.5 million. So there's some real protection for the Bears there. He's getting the $3 million. That's the only thing he's for sure getting up front right now. But then he'll get another 4.5. He's on the field for 10% of the plays, and if the team improves in some mystery offensive categories. Then they added another $2.5 million to playing time. We don't know what the percentage is. It's got to be more than 10%. But if he hits a certain percentage of the playing time, whether it's 40%, 50%, 80% of the snaps, they'll set a number. He'll get an extra $2.5 million. And then there's a final bonus on there if the Bears make the playoffs. He gets $2 million. I'm no math major, but I add up those numbers quick together in my head, and I get $12.5 million total, which was the original number that Adam Schefter mentioned as the maximum up to $12.5 million contract. And then he said $10 million likely to be earned was the other word. And because if we do the math from Brad Biggs' tweet, $3 million base salary he's getting, $4.5 million if he reaches 10% of the snaps, almost very likely to be on the field for 10% of the snaps. So that would put him at 7.5. And then another $2.5 million is tied to playing time. Assuming he stays healthy, he's going to hit that playing time threshold. Ideally, the Bears want him to play 17 games, be on the field for every snap. So that 3 plus 4.5 plus 2.5 would put him at that $10 million. So that's where Schefter says that Riley Reiff is likely to make $10 million and then up to 12.5 because that 2 million, or up to 12 because that $2 million playoff bonus is a bit less likely at this point for the Bears this season. But as that works on the books then, is Riley Reiff only counts against the salary cap for that $3 million base. So he only is costing $3 million this season. Michael Schofield is basically on a veteran minimum deal, costing about $1 million. So the Bears spent $4 million to get their starting left tackle and their starting right guard right before training camp opened. Really effective financial management, identifying very real concerns, questions, holes on the offensive line, and addressing them in a very fiscally responsible way that currently leaves the Bears with, I think, about $18 million in salary cap space still. Usually teams want to hold on to $5 to $7 to $10 even million worth of salary cap in season in case they need to sign an emergency player and maybe pay for it, or if they want to make a midseason trade and need to absorb some salary in that. They keep emergency money on hand. You're not required to spend all of it through the season, but that still leaves them with, at least 8 in there that you could go out and spend on other players up to this point. So, they may still have something up their sleeve at some point as training camp goes on. And at the end of the day, it's great for the Bears to have him here and great opportunity for him to earn up to $10 million, which I think is more than he got last year from the Bengals. It was a 1-year, $7.5 million deal. So he's likely to get a pay raise from what he got last season, but he's not costing the Bears a ton of money. It feels kind of like a win-win there in terms of making the finances work. It can be difficult to get players to agree to a structure like that because, again, if he gets hurt, he does not get anything more than that $3 million. And usually players just want the money sort of already assured to them that, like, yes, you're getting, just put in my base salary. Why do you have to set this threshold? Just give me the money. So it's good for the Bears that Reiff agreed to structure it that way. Gives them a lot of space and also gives them that offensive tackle. So I think all around, really, really solid move. Great job by Ryan Poles to be proactive, to go out and get the additional offensive line competition before you see it struggle first, right? We were thinking that they could get to training camp, watch Mustipher, watch Borum, watch Jenkins, watch Braxton Jones, and say, oh, wait a minute, we need something else in here. And then add the players, the free agents later, and then have them be even more behind to have to catch up before the regular season and all that. Some proactivity here right at training camp. Get them in from the beginning. Keep it an open competition. Let the young guys still compete and try and earn a potential starting job. But realistically, we know from left to right, it's Riley Reiff, Cody Whitehair, Lucas Patrick, Michael Schofield, and then right tackle is going to either be Tevin Jenkins or Larry Borum. Much better place to be in on the offensive line than we were a week ago. And it eases so much of that concern about Justin Fields, right? It's like he needs a better offensive line in front of him so he can properly develop as a quarterback. He could use better wide receivers in that process too, but I think for him especially, the offensive line is going to be a bigger factor. Not that Reiff and Schofield make the Bears a top 5 offensive line in the NFL, but they were definitely at the bottom of the league, bottom 3. And now I think they're a lot closer into that, top 25, top 20, 15-ish range for the potential at least, if some of these veterans can provide some of the consistency that we've seen them provide throughout a lot of their career. You can be sure we'll keep you up to date on all developments in this Bears offensive line competitions right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So I hope you'll hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. The Locked On Podcast Network has you covered for all of your Chicago Bears sports needs. We got a new Locked On Cubs team breaking down Cubs baseball for you this season. Locked On Bulls hitting you strong with that offseason content. Locked On Blackhawks as well, and so much more. Locked On Sports is your team every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I hope then that Locked On Bears makes it that much easier for you to bear down.